welcome to another review video. My name's Caleb Sanders. I'm just another reader, and I love reading fantasy, sci-fi, history. I'm an educator, and so I love to approach an analysis of different books and their themes and their strengths and weaknesses. And today, we're getting to Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. This book took me over 2 months to get to, which there's a variety of reasons for that, being a parent, being an educator, and also just some complexities and things about this book that we will definitely have to look into. If you are not aware and have been living under a rock, you most likely know the name Brandon Sanderson. I was first introduced to Brandon Sanderson when he finished off the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, and the fact that he could pick up writing from a master writer like Robert Jordan and for the most part match his voice and cadence and story and everything, it made me really drawn to him as a writer. I then picked up Elantris and then Mistborn Final Kingdom and continued to fall in love with his writing style and the complexity of his plot and storytelling and characters. I then went and picked up The Way of Kings, which at that time was the first book and the only book out in the Stormlight Archive yet, and I devoured this book in about a weekend. I loved it that much and fell in love with the characters, the storytelling, the flashbacks, and honestly, Brandon Sanderson wouldn't have been able to write this book. In fact, he talks about he couldn't write this book in its current format without having gone through the Wheel of Time and learning how to write such multi-complex POV characters and stories. And so getting to Wind and Truth finally, after 2 months of reading, I've seen all of the YouTube videos that have been out there, all the responses. It seems like a lot of negative, but I promise I have not watched a single review, which has been really hard. And to finally get to a review of this book, it's been a long time coming. So what this video is going to entail is what I liked about Wind and Truth, what didn't work for me, where Stormlight was better in previous books, what could have been, what kind of some theories I have that what might have worked a little bit better, and then where we go from here as fans of Brandon Sanderson and of the Stormlight Archive. So without further ado, it should be said, spoilers. Just getting that out there. Now, what I liked and really loved about Wind and Truth was, as always, Brandon Sanderson, his complexity of storytelling, his characters, his plots, especially the ending. Brandon Sanderson has really made himself known in the literary genre, in the fantasy genre, for his complex writing and the various themes that he brings about. You could argue that Wind and Truth was a little too complicated, but I think that as the culmination of a 5-book arc like the Stormlight Archive, that complexity was right on point. It should also be noted he's tying together so many different books and series that is linking up this Cosmere, which Stormlight Archive very obviously is going to be the pinnacle and ultimately the fulcrum of that entire Cosmere connected world. And I think he did a good job in culminating it with Wind and Truth. The themes that Brandon Sanderson includes in Wind and Truth are very familiar from previous books, obviously, and in some ways is the culmination, in some ways maybe a little step away or a reinvestigation of some of these themes that characters have gone through and that the world has gone through and explore. We have definitely, obviously, sacrifice. We have the transformation of characters, honor, and duty that are played out for our main characters, especially talking about Dalinar, to even Sigil, getting to him, to Jasna, I always forget how to pronounce her name, Adolin especially, and his facing such overwhelming odds as they went and support the Azir, Emperor of Azir, something like that. But anyways, what's amazing about Wind and Truth also is the fact that within this title, you think about, there we go, you think about the use of Wind and Truth. I know some people, it seemed, were irritated about the title, but Wind, this idea of freedom, right? We have these different themes where Odium and the Fused are trying to seek freedom from Roshar. You also have freedom for Szeth, Sun. You also have freedom for Kaladin from his trauma that he's fully faced, which he then definitely is needed as the end of this book goes. And seeing this play out as we see change take about, change within and change without, and then truth ultimately being that idea of self-reflection and honesty. Dalinar for sure, right? Which then you could obviously say that that could be tied to honor, and with the flashbacks, the idea of the gods and just truth and honesty to themselves, and self-reflection of the heralds, Odium, facing self-reflection for the most part, even having some secret self-reflections that Odium, aka Retribution, if you've read the book, you should have it by this point. Again, if you have not read Wind and Truth, spoilers from this point out, already said a lot. But these themes that are coming in are so pivotal to this story that I think Brandon Sanderson did an amazing job, especially with the idea of change, freedom, self-reflection, and honesty, just like come about in this book. The humanization of the heralds was something I thought was really good, because from the very beginning of The Way of Kings, you were introduced to the heralds in a way. You're introduced to the lore, and you start get to throughout the Cosmere a little bit, but really throughout the Stormlight Archive, you get to know them and their weaknesses, the taint or the madness, the magical madness that they have, that Brandon Sanderson wants to include. And as you're going through Wind and Truth, you get to know, obviously, Nail, you get to know, forgetting all of their names right now, Ishar, something like that. Anyways, Brandon has a lot of different names throughout these books, but especially the revelation that Shallan's mother was a herald, and then you see her madness played out in that flashback. I thought that was a really interesting flashback and culmination of a story. Now, did that story need to be revisited in another way? I don't know. I feel like that storyline of Shallan and her backstory was already capped off, but it felt like Brandon was trying to milk a little bit more out of that storyline. But ultimately, it was an interesting reveal that Shallan's mother was a herald. Can we talk about Taravangian? I have to say, Taravangian was the perfect idea. I was very concerned at the end of Rhythm of War with Taravangian taking up the Shard of Odium, that one book was not going to be enough to have this new bad antagonist who is galactic in scale, that the other shards fear, and has been isolated to Roshar, and these shards are okay with him being contained to Roshar because out of sight, out of mind. With Taravangian becoming Odium, throughout this story there is just there's a loathing for the character, and there is an absolute Thanos level appreciation for the tenacity, for the honesty, and for ultimately just the level of destruction, defeat. I mean, the destruction of Kharbranth at the right when Cultivation has a hand up on Odium and trying to convince him to face and bring humanity to Odium, and ultimately then the seizing of honor and the creation of Retribution, where you see the fear that the other shards are gonna now have to face this power in Roshar. It's just absolutely incredible, and I cannot wait to see where Brandon Sanderson goes with this. I hope he does not go so far into all the different realms. I hope he really does focus in on the second arc of Stormlight Archive, because if he gets caught up in a lot of side books, kind of like Lost Metal and stuff like that, I feel like we could start to get away from this core fear of what Retribution is. And so I hope that's something that he gets into sooner rather than later, without 50 other books that are getting away from this amazing antagonist. At least hopefully his Retribution's fingers are going to be in the rest of the Cosmere from this point forward. Adolin's story for me felt the most like the early Stormlight Archive books, The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance in particular, as he goes and defends the city of Azir from the onslaught of the Fused, which that whole sequence was absolutely amazing, especially him not being able to have his shard blade because of the legacy of what happened in Rhythm of War at the very end with the trial and everything that took place. So I felt like his storyline was absolutely amazing, especially him playing towers with the Emperor was something that had a ton of foreshadowing throughout the book, which I think Brandon Sanderson, I should have seen it, that the Sunmaker's Gambit was gonna be an important aspect, but I think Brandon Sanderson dropped these little breadcrumbs throughout the story that when it culminated in the end, it was like, that was really good. And so Adolin's story I thought was absolutely amazing. Sigzil's story as well I thought was amazing to set up the evolution of Sigzil as he's going forward, and I mean the sacrifice that was made with sacrificing of his spren to save his spren, but ultimately, I mean, you know how that all works out at this point. And then setting him on the course for where he will end up in Sunlit Man, I think that was a really good choice as well. Really gut-wrenching, but I think Sigzil and Adolin's stories were peak Stormlight Archive in this book. ultimately the positives of Wind and Truth really does come down to the ending. I feel like a massive spider web of details and storylines and plot structures and just pieces that have been scattered throughout the Cosmere so far are tied together in the ending of this story. There's definitely some mixed feelings, obviously, with the death of Dalinar. I mean, Brandon Sanderson does not kill off main characters often, other than like Teft, and that was definitely, I think, he still wasn't fully a main character. So Dalinar finally killing off a main character, it felt a little not anticlimactic, because I feel like Dalinar's sacrifice for Gavilar, his grandson, his adopted grandson, was his grandnephew, you know what, all the family ties at this point. But Dalinar's sacrifice there was gut-wrenching, because you wanted Dalinar to be the Blackthorn, you wanted him to stand up, and then the fact that there was this shade of the Blackthorn in the spiritual realm that now Retribution uses to be able to head his armies. I mean, oh my gosh, that is going to be chaotic to say the least. But that ending with the Sunmaker Gambit, with Dalinar finally understanding honor and taking it up, and then releasing it, revoking his oath, the scream of honor having this happen, and then Retribution emerging, but the Sunmaker Gambit with this time warp that's going on that really explains where the sphere is, and you kind of see, and ultimately, I mean, Retribution, let's be honest, Retribution is going to be way more powerful than Harmony. Harmony, so much power in Harmony comes from the balance of the creation destruction forces, forget their actual names right now, but this idea of honor and odium being this retributive force, it's almost going to be too much for Taravangian to hold, I think, because there's going to be such a movement to bring change, maybe. But if anyone can balance the two, it will be Taravangian. So I think Brandon Sanderson has his work cut out for him to keep a very interesting storyline moving forward. And Kaladin, the idea of him taking up leadership, being the king of the heralds, such a mixed bag, obviously. The fact that this man who has gone through so much has healed enough that he is able to take up this mantle. You wanted him to have the happy ending, and there still is time, because ultimately we know that it's going to take about 10 years their time, but thousands in the era of the Cosmere for it to come about, and we will see Kaladin again. We better see Kaladin again and all these other characters, and seeing where will Roshar go from here. Cannot wait to see that, and that's honestly some amazing things I like about Wind and Truth. So what did not work for me about Wind and Truth? For me, I feel like it almost was too big for what Brandon Sanderson was trying to accomplish. It was so, I mean, this book is already, what, it's almost 1,300 pages. I mean, this book is massive as it is, and it felt like he tried to put too much in, so stuff was crammed together, stuff was shortened down to try to fit more together, and just felt choppy at times. It felt episodic in a way, whereas the previous books felt like a cohesive whole, long, but cohesive whole all the way through, whereas this Wind and Truth just was so technical, it felt very choppy as you read through it. The humor, for me, was very YA. I mean, Brandon Sanderson, I feel like since his writing of the what's it called, the Skyward series, that his humor has gotten a little more YA, especially in the beginning, kind of the bathroom humor with Kaladin's little brother, right? Little brother, something like that. It just felt a little out of place, especially Syl's kind of, we'll say, her anatomy humor. It just felt so out of place, and felt like Brandon Sanderson has been, I mean, honestly, since the Kickstarter that took place in 2021, his humor in his writing has been a little shifted. It doesn't match up with this being more epic fantasy. It switches more into the YA, and it just pulls you out of that immersion, which for me is something that the Stormlight Archive especially has done well. Is just immerse you into this world, and the humor just kind of doesn't work for me. Lift doesn't work for me. Wit, the more you see him, he's one of those, sprinkle him throughout and he's amazing. You have too much of him, it's a little bit of too much of a good thing. If you know what I mean, that's just my opinion. Maybe you think that, maybe you don't, I don't know. Some of the character voices felt a little out of place for me, especially Dalinar. Maybe that's because we didn't see him for majority of Rhythm of War. that he is a character that is so vital to the story, especially the outcome of Wind and Truth, that his inner dialogue felt different for some reason. He and Navani especially. You get to Renarin, you get to Adolin felt like maybe the most like himself, Kaladin and in stretches, but it just felt like the character voices felt different. And I believe I am missing some short stories because I missed Rock for sure. Him not being here, I'm pretty sure I missed a short story somewhere, but there were some characters that felt missing, and then there was an overuse of some characters that just felt out of place. With so many POVs throughout these books, it felt too much. It felt very choppy, as I said before, because you would go from one person to another, and they just Brandon Sanderson just included some that probably could have been left out for me. For example, the whole Wit meeting Risen and them both being shards, finding out that Wit gave up a shard or a Dawn shard and retook it up. I mean, that's an amazing scene, but it felt so quick for such a pivotal thing that it felt like it was out of place a little bit. I feel like it could have been included in another story, maybe, as a little test, a little nugget that is a relation to this Stormlight Archive series. The Rescue of Zahel, I mean, there was things that just could have been combined, included. When you have so many POVs and so many characters going which directions, it just felt so scattered from this way to that way to this way to that way. It could have been a little more cohesive in my mind. It seems like Brandon is including a little more adult humor or adult content as he's going along. Obviously, there's some scenes regarding more intimate moments and intimacy and sex, and that's just something that he more alluded to and never really included. And it feels like he's trying to branch out and be more broad and attract more audience. And some people would label that as woke. I think that Brandon Sanderson is just trying to include a greater variety to make more people happy, but it feels like it almost waters down the story a little bit because he's getting away from his styles and voices from earlier writing, which obviously he's a different writer now. He's older, he's had more experience, but in some ways it feels like he is not as authentic to his early voices. Maybe he's writing too much, maybe he has too many voices contributing to his story. I know he changed editors. That might be something as well, that he's gotten away from his early voice, but it's just something that feels a little out of place and a little different for me. It's not bad, it just feels different, and I don't know whether I like it or not. Another thing that didn't really work for me in Wind and Truth is I felt like the flashbacks were good. They weren't the weakest. I think the flashbacks in Rhythm of War were my least favorite flashbacks, but these were up there as well because we already know that Seth Sunsun is truthless. We already know that story. We already have enough nuggets from his story that doing the flashbacks to see why he ended up as truthless, I get that you're trying to see his relationship with his father and find out more about the culture where he's from and the idea of, I think it's Ashar, I'm forgetting the name of the herald who ends up being the one who's mad and trying to convert the Spren and having a new army and all that, but it just felt like it felt out of place to me. I feel like, I don't know who would have been a better one. Maybe Adolin could have been a good one because his background and then that being pivotal for a change for Dalinar's storyline a little bit. It probably was the right choice for a background for the flashbacks, but it felt long because you're in this pilgrimage narrative storyline with Kaladin and with Seth, and then Nail comes along. It just kind of then, do you know what I mean? I don't know. Anyways. But as I was saying, with the flashbacks coinciding with the pilgrimage, it felt slow, some action, but slow, a lot of philosophy, a lot of slow narrative. It just felt like it was one of those skippy break episodes that just didn't really work with the story, in my opinion. Probably the best Brandon could have done. Trust him at this point, but it just felt a little out of place for me. Also, the final thing that didn't really work for me as much is I know this whole 10-day sequence, the entire book taking place in 10 days, I think it worked, but with the rest of the series being so stretched out and so pivotal, I think it does do an amazing thing to show that in such a quick amount of time things can change, but at the same time it felt like too much change too fast, especially stuff that is so pivotal for the future of the Cosmere, that the 10-day, I think it was a good attempt at something. It just felt like it was a little bit of a miss. I think it could be incorporated, but I'll talk about that here in a little bit. And then finally, editing. It could have been 100 pages shorter, I think, and still have everything. You can cut that down by cutting out some of the POVs, combine some storylines, and that would just allow it to be a much more thorough and smooth story in my opinion. But what do I know? So where has Stormlight been better? In my opinion, the first 3 books, the character development of Way of Kings, of Words of Radiance, there, and of Oathbringer especially, you have those character development moments that are so much more pivotal. Yes, Navani in Rhythm of War is a very pivotal development and understanding of her character, especially with her taking up and bonding with the Tower Spren. And then also the Rhythm of War that comes about and all the technicalities of that. But I think the character development of the early ones just was so fresh that in Wind and Truth it felt just a little bit forced. Some of the other things is the humor. I think for me, peak humor for Brandon Sanderson, that's a merger of his humor type with the storyline, is definitely in Words of Radiance with Shallan and the Stick. I just think that was such dry humor that was within that I chuckled so much reading that, and every time I reread it or listen to it in an audiobook, it fits so well. As well as in here, Shallan and Kaladin, their relationship. I think their bickering back and forth was something that was just peak humor in the Stormlight Archive, obviously with Rock in the first, in The Way of Kings, with the bridge running and the bridge cruise and just everything that was going on there. I felt like it was the best humor and just felt so forced, especially with the lift and with wit in Wind and Truth. Humor's a little bit better in those early ones. When it comes to action as well, yes, Wind and Truth had some really good action moments, but so much more of it was almost anime in a way where it's like quick action, and then it's slow talk, build, philosophical, especially that last, the duel fight and everything. And referring to the pilgrimage with Zeth and everything. But the action, obviously, in Way of Kings, you have the bridge runs, especially the final bridge run where Kaladin saves Dalinar and Adolin. That action sequences were just amazing. With Words of Radiance, when you have the arena fight, when you have the final battle out on the Shattered Plains, that was just incredible action that turned on so many character developments and pivotal moments, especially with Kaladin recovering and re-emerging and regaining Syl. With Oathbringer, oh my gosh, the end sequence of that with the it's not Kharbranth, forget the name of the city where they're fighting with, where Oathbringer comes about, where Dalinar takes up and bonds with the ultimately Honor, but he's the Skyfather at that time. And the action in this was absolutely just gut-wrenching and visceral, and with the rage that the Alethi had, forget what that's called, the war song that they would always listen to. And then ultimately with Rhythm of War, especially Kaladin and the Pursuer, the defeated, I just think the action sequences were so much more gripping in the previous books. Wind and Truth, it was good, it just wasn't as good as the previous one. So that was something that kind of let you down a little bit. It's very philosophical, more anime than the previous works. And then finally, the flashbacks. I would say for me, the key flashbacks for the Stormlight Archive would be Way of Kings, with having the flashbacks of Kaladin to figure out more why he is where he is. And then Oathbringer. I mean, come on, those are the 2 best flashbacks of the entire series. Shallan had good flashbacks, but for me, her character is a little interesting. She has some amazing moments, but it just draws out a lot where she's kind of a negative Nancy. It's needed, but her character, I think, has too many things that kind of rinse and repeat. She figures things out and then goes back, and then figures things out and go back, which we all have that. I understand that, but to read about it, it just felt a little bit long. And then obviously Kaladin is one of those characters that you just really want to have his flashback sequences there. Now, what could have been with this story? In my opinion, the 10-day sequencing was a great idea. The first half of the book could have been the 10 days, culminate with the battle on the tower, and at the moment of the picking up of Honor, I feel like then Dalinar and Odium, there could have been this clash with them together, that then they are launched into the spirit realm. I think the spirit realm thing with Dalinar and Navani and Renarin and R'hllyn and Shallan and everybody going through, especially with the Ghost Bloods, that whole thing, I think it was good, but at the same time, it felt so like follow Shallan, maybe follow a couple people in the spirit realm so you get that idea as they're looking for the Spren. Bo something. Brandon Sanderson has a lot of names in these books, but these characters that are developing through that spiritual realm journey could have still taken place a little bit, and then Dalinar goes through it, and we see the beginning, we see honor, we see the giving up, the breaking of things, you see the creation of the heralds, you see all of that, for then like the middle or the last, the second third of the book, and then you have the culmination. I just think that would have been a much better thing rather than this whole sequenced day, everything happened in the end. It just felt like that could have been a better culmination with everything happening in the space of a heartbeat, is Dalinar and Odium, and just this journey through history of Roshar and of the Cosmere could have been an interesting way, and then that clash with the resolution of it being something that has the resounding effect throughout the Cosmere, especially with the time warp that's around Roshar at this time. That's just something that I was thinking. I think that a lot of the storylines could have been merged. Sigzil, I think his storyline, and then Renar and Relaine, that whole dynamic, their story could have been combined along with the other of the not the fused of the people of the Shattered Plains as they go. They could have combined all of that into one storyline. You could have had Yasna and her storyline. She could have been combined maybe with Adolin and could have merged their storylines together, and that would have been a much more interesting, more dynamic and focused storyline that could have just shortened the story a little bit and made it more focused and less episodic in nature, because you're jumping through all of these different POVs. The final ending with the death of Dalinar, which again, Brandon Sanderson doesn't kill off characters a lot, so the death of a major character like Dalinar is huge. I wonder if the Blackthorn in the future one is going to be redeemed and be able to return kind of as Dalinar, maybe. I don't know. That could be something that Brandon Sanderson plays around with. But something I was thinking, but that could have been interesting to have a dynamic slightly different that might have been a little more satisfying and keep Dalinar around, but in a contained way that he then comes about in the second arc of Stormlight Archive, is that what if Odium in the clash at Kharbranth with Cultivation actually killed Cultivation, and as Odium seizes Cultivation, I think Cultivation and Odium do go hand in hand. Cultivation with the bringing about of new things, Odium and passion and this idea of taking over, that could have merged with Cultivation, and then the Skyfather with honor, ultimately being honor, would have then Dalinar would be able to connect with him better, because obviously Dalinar and the loss of Evie, and then the Stormfather and Honor losing Cultivation, I think there would have been a way of then now they are united, and that is the way that Dalinar is able to understand, and maybe Honor is shredding the planet apart because of the rage at the death of Cultivation, and maybe Odium, as he's picking up Cultivation, is all of a sudden in fear, and then Dalinar in that rage, it's a callback to Oathbringer. It's a callback to what he has come through and developed through, and he then recognizes Honor and picks up Honor, and then that creates this time warp that maybe Honor being weaker is then contained and captured by Odium within Roshar itself. But then, I mean, it still is an amazing outcome the way that he had it. I can't get over the death of Dalinar. I mean, he's such an amazing character, tied with Caladan as my favorite characters in Stormlight Archive, that it was hard to see him die. I think I'm still trying to just cope with his loss, but ultimately, for me, I think that could have been an interesting way, but Brandon Sanderson made his choice. It turned out great. I have to learn how to be okay with it. And then ultimately, the Sunmaker Gambit, I mean, that great breadcrumbs throughout the book of Wind and Truth, that had a great culmination. Now, where do we go from here? I mean, the Cosmere is in flux because of the Sunmaker Gambit, because of the time flux. Roshar, I believe he said, is going to be 10 years before it settles out, and around the Cosmere, it literally could be thousands of years before it takes place, because one, Roshar is going to be so advanced, the rest of the universe has to maybe go advance further, and how the shards are going to interact and interplay with each other to work on opposing Retribution is something that is going to be very interesting to see play out. I think the other stories in this time warp is going to be interesting. I think the changing of Roshar with the certain areas being free of Retribution's effect, especially in Azir, and then seeing the effect of the storm and the gifting of powers and lightning. It's going to be interesting to see where Brandon Sanderson goes with this, with the storyline of the second arc of Stormlight Archive, especially with going to space. And we saw Risen basically say that her ship is going to be levitating going into space. And now we're going to see that travel between systems, the travel between stars. We already saw that a little bit in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, as you saw the one planet reaching out to the other planet. And so it's going to be interesting to see where the advancement of these systems, because we know Brandon Sanderson loves a hard magic system, which maybe it's a little too rigid and gets a little static or a little too detailed at some point, but it is an amazing creation of his mind that I'm looking forward to seeing where he goes with, because really the space, the limit, the Cosmere, the limit at what Brandon Sanderson is going to be able to do in the future books and future series within the Stormlight Archive, or within the Cosmere. I like the fact that Kaladin will be back. I mean, it's going to be 10 years, I believe, and so 10 years of pain, not pain, however that's going to figure out with their minds being separate. The healing of the Heralds is going to come about, still being around. The fact that Kaladin is the king of the Heralds now is going to be really interesting. I cannot wait to see what Brandon Sanderson decides to do with his character and where he's going to go with his character. I mean, something's going to tell me that at the end of the second arc, Kaladin is going to have a pivotal role, and this may be just me coping with the death of Dalinar, but I want Kaladin to have a Cosmere level hand and Cosmere level role. Maybe with the, I don't know, picking up of shards, maybe? I mean, maybe if he becomes on, I don't know. We'll see where he goes, but I think Kaladin deserves a happy ending, which, I mean, you could argue that this is a happy ending, but it's just a stepping stone to a greater story. We know that from Sunlit Man that Kaladin, Sigzil says that poor Kaladin's in a space, but that could be that Sunlit Man is still in this 10-year time warp, and Sigil's like, oh, poor Kaladin, where he's at right now. We don't know. We don't know how everything's going to take place and how everything's going to line up, but I'm excited to see it, especially with Retribution being this Thanos-level power that the Cosmere is going to have to face. I can't wait to see where he goes. So for me, Wind and Truth, yes, it has a lot of negatives. Yes, it has some things that I was not as comfortable with, or that I thought was choppy and episodic, and that they were in some ways weakest of the Stormlight Archive, and in some ways the best of the Stormlight Archive. This isn't, for me, even the worst book of... this isn't the worst book of the series. It's not definitely not my favorite for sure, but I think from what people have said, what I've kind of glimpsed, that some people are giving this way too hard of a time because of how much they love the Stormlight Archive and various books of the Cosmere. I know it's been a long video. Thank you for sticking around with me. I do think that the future of the Cosmere is bright as long as Brandon Sanderson stays true to who he is and has voices around him that can help him to bring his vision to light in a good, clear, concise way that I think was a little missed at times in Wind and Truth, but ultimately, what an ending to this first arc of the Stormlight Archive. I'm probably going to pick up Way of Kings again at some point, because I think now, after having finished it, going back through and rereading the Stormlight Archive will be something that is impactful. I'll probably do a video of a wrap-up or discussion of the whole first arc of Stormlight Archive after rereading, now that we know the culmination of these stories. Well, thank you so much for sticking around here. My channel, I renamed it recently. It used to be the Sanders Review. Now it's just another reader. Just felt like that was a little more in tone with what I am going into with books and reading and stuff. So thank you so much for sticking around. God bless. Have a wonderful day. Go read some good books. We'll talk to you later.